Hi there. I wanted to take you through one of the slide presentations that we normally do this time of year that tries to put the idea of computer art into some kind of broader context and to give perhaps a definition of what computer art is or could be thought as. And we're going to work on this idea, first of all, of computer art equaling the idea of, first of all, input, as we've talked about in the past, the idea of inputting something, process, and output. Very much in the model of the cybernetic ideas that we've had. And what I'm going to do is take you through a range of examples that of how this might be interpreted when you look at an artwork, both traditional artworks and traditional ideas in artworks, and then more importantly in computer, and how computer artists think about these ideas and how they use these ideas. So let's start with an example, the first slide. Hans Hack's condensing cube made in the 1960s, which really does embrace ideas of biological, ecological systems, and of course very much cybernetics, because there is a continual feedback process going on, and it's very simply a cube that is condensing water. Okay, so it's generative, the water, the steam moving around inside the cube. It's very simple in its concept, but fundamentally it is going to be cybernetic because the water is cyclical. It's going round and generating round as it condensing and moves around. So the input is obviously going to be water. The process is a condensation, and the output of where the water gathers on the side of the cube. And these was the condensing cube was installed in galleries, etc., as an artwork in its own right. Another artist that I think most of you are familiar with, because we are often using him to illustrate ideas, is Pike, and his, in particular, his magnetic TVs, which we visited in the past, whereby he puts these magnets that disrupt the image on the screen. So the intervention there is the magnet itself, and by turning the magnet, so ultimately what you've got is the input is the TV signal. Okay, the process is the movement of the signal, and the output is the disruption of that TV signal. If we move it on to another artwork, an early artwork by Georges Ness, who we've looked at in the past again, with his idea of this disruptive grid. So the notion of a square, starting with a square and then moving through the grid, we can see how that would work, because the input to start with is the grid itself. Okay, and then the process is a random and a generative disruption of that grid. So each square just changes slightly as it goes through. So we start with this notion of order, and we end up with chaos at the end. And the output is a display of that disruption. Okay. And he's obviously working on ideas of chaos, order and chaos, and the theories behind that. And we're going to look into these ideas, about the ideas that are going on behind these works and how they affect our thinking about these works in a minute. Frida Narka's work. Again, we've looked at Narka's work. This one, Homage to Paul Klee, the image here. This is where he's drawing his inspiration. So there's some art world context going on here, where he's drawing inspiration from work that exists and creating this work, okay, that was derived from that. And let's have a little look at his input, process, output, okay. What he was doing was creating a randomly generated artwork Okay. And the input were lines and circles. And the process here, we've got a written description of the process, change of the original width and horizontal bands, these bands going across, the buckle at the bottom of the bands, the number of signs, okay, per quadrilateral, vertical lines, triangles, positions of these lines, additional circles, positions of circles, sizes of radiuses, all these things are part of the process, okay? And then the output is the reconfiguration of that image based on this process. So what we need to do is perhaps think about the context of what these artists are working in. And one of them was the way these artists very much thought about their work as conceptual art. So perhaps to a little look at what we mean by that, and what we mean by conceptual art. In conceptual art, okay, the artist has a program, an intention behind the work, yeah? The process of making the work and the resulting artifact really starts to emphasize the value of that work. So the whole thing gets combined into a whole. In this example, Richard Long made a piece called A Line Made by Walking. And it was really where he went into an area, a field with a patch of grass, and then just walked backwards and forwards over a period of time and created the line. But the work is more than just that, because what he's starting to think about are ideas such as impermanence, because that line won't last, okay, motion, the notion of time, transition and movement. His work is always concerned with transition and movement. It's certainly minimal. It's anti-materialistic. There is absolutely, you require nothing than the process of walking to create it. Richard Long is very much an artist who's influenced by nature, obviously walking, and then the role that the artist plays in making such a work. So all of these are concepts that he's working with. And as an art object, all we have is a photograph, okay? So that's all that's left is this photograph. Yeah. So we need to understand the work in terms of the ideas and the actions that he was taking. So the concept becomes very much part of the process, okay? Let's think about this idea of object. What do we mean by an art object? So perhaps we need to kind of take that idea a little bit further. In the 1960s, as I've written down here, philosophers such as the American Nielsen Goldman put forward a theory that an art object was something that you read as part of a greater symbol rather than being an object for contemplation. Okay, so rather than this idea of the beautiful image and it sits there, hangs on the wall, and you just sit there and contemplate it, there are a much greater range of things going on with the image. Lots of signs, symbols, context, etc., etc. So it becomes, the object becomes much bigger than the physical thing that you're looking at. And he introduces a much more semantic approach to looking at artworks. So if we take this example here, the famous image of the sunflowers, okay? I mean, in essence, the object is no more than a canvas with paint on it. We could extend that slightly, saying that it's a picture of a flower. But the object really, if we view it as an object, is much greater than that. But yes, it's a canvas, of course. There's paint, it's brush strokes, there's a frame. Even the position on the wall in a gallery, these are all part of the object itself, where it's sitting, how you're viewing it. There's also, is it an example of the artist as a genius? Obviously, people have portrayed Van Gogh as a genius, a tortured genius, as we put down here, the tortured artist. So the image is starting to take on a whole bunch of signs and symbols about it. He's challenging the role of image making. Again, I think we've talked about this in the past. Image making was being challenged because of the invention of photography. So there's some context going on now in why artists are starting to move away from traditional ways of painting and drawing. His images and works were very much about expressing emotion and feeling. There's formal composition, okay, and that might extend to ideas that he's had with different ways of making art. For example, a lot of the Sunflower series were exercises in working with very limited color palettes, for example. So we can see here that the art object now is becoming much bigger than this notion of what we mean by an object of art. If we go back to the line made of walking, we can have a look at the art object now in terms of it being a photograph, a line in the grass, a text caption, okay, the white space, again, where it's placed on a wall, the artist program that we've talked about, its historical context, etc., etc., etc. So here we can see that it's much broader. Let's take this idea into looking at a piece of early computer art. Georges Ness's 23 polygons and 23 vertices that he made, whereby fed in what we call a probability distribution, i.e. a range of possible positions. A probability distribution, as we've seen over here, it's like a dice. There are 6 possibilities, okay? So it's a limited range, but it's still random. So he feeds in a number of random positions to create each individual image, okay, in the sequence. So again, if we take it now as the idea of a whole object, we've got a print. Yeah. It's definitely, again, where it's placed on the wall. Now then, its historical context can start to become quite important because it's playing around with this notion of random in the same way perhaps Hans Art was playing around with that notion of a random, which brings us on to the role of the artist. Who is the artist? What is the artist? Definitely concerned with form and composition. This idea of artist intuition, I'm going to come back to that in a minute, about what this idea about this was concerned with here, but it's also concerned with the notion of randomness. We've talked about that, and this idea of the probability distribution. There's a system, there's a process, sign, symbol, and semantics, which are now starting to get tied up into these ideas of the role of the artist. It's involved with mathematics and geometry. There's a concept and methodology being put into place here. There's an algorithm that has to be used to generate the images. And of course, there's variability, absolutely vital to these images. Again, as we've talked about, the uniqueness of these images, that when the computer runs that each time it runs, there's a variability in its output. And that's part of the concept, part of the methodology. So that's how you start to eventually define the idea of the art object in terms of a piece of computer art. So that brings us on to a number of things that are being talked about in that kind of image and in Narka's image. The idea of random. And we use random a lot, you know, when we're working with processing, etc. We can use it in all sorts of different ways. We can use it, though, to, in general, what we're trying to do when we use random is simulate something, okay, something that doesn't exist, and or something that we want to recreate. In Narka's case, he sees that the random process, okay, so rather than a random process either replicating or being equal to what we call the artist's intuition, because we do, when we start out thinking about making a work, we've got some intuition about where we want to go with a piece of work. It's no different from a scientist. A scientist will have an intuition about a set of ideas, and then he will create a set of experiments to try and get to that, you know, get to that conclusion. But along the way, he might find out all sorts of other conclusions. However, it's that at that point there's some intuition. Okay, and random could be a replication for that intuition, But that's not what Narka's claiming. What he's claiming is that his work is a generative process of creating a probability distribution, okay? And this has replaced the role of intuition. So the idea that that the artist doesn't have intuition anymore, okay? What he has is this or a computer artist has this random probability distribution, as we talked about, idea like the throwing of the dice, to replace the role, okay? So this is meant like in conceptual art, where program, process, and artifact combine. The generative process and its implications on the artwork are part of the art object. Okay, so random, generative ideas become part of the object of art that we're looking at. Therefore, the position of randomness in this process is integral to our relationship with the object, because randomness has substituted the artist's decision making. Yeah. This, again, this idea of simulating decision-making. Narka goes on to use this concept of a macro aesthetic, okay? And this is how he defines the intuitive process in art. It happens when we act upon our idea, okay? So we have an idea about how we're moving forward with the drawing, the artwork, our process, etc., 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 okay? And then we act upon that. We make decisions about where the lines are going to go, how the colors are going to look, how the composition is going to work, etc., etc. But when we run a computer, something else is taking over. And that's where he's using this idea of randomness to take over from that process of intuition. Narka does not intend that at a microaesthetic level the computer simulates the role of intuition. In other words, he is not claiming creativity from the computer, but assigning the role of the random generation at this level. He's defining a particular role for the computer as part of the art object. Yeah. So whether a computer can be creative is another discussion, much more an AI discussion. But within the work of someone like Narka, what you're getting is he's finding a way of bringing intuition at a micro level, okay, the decision-making processes that go on when we make a work of art, and assigning that over to randomness. Just quickly back to that piece of work. Now we've got some of these ideas in place. And in his work, there are global structures, okay? So this idea of a global structure, the boundary box, for example, as well as the direction of the horizontal lines across the page. So he sets up these global ideas. And then there are other rules state that these horizontal lines should not meet. So he's writing other rules as part of the process. And then, of course, we've got this reference back to Paul Klee's work, which gives us a greater semantic and contextual view of the work. And then finally, the role that randomness plays is also part of the global structure and can also be read as a sign, i.e. one that questions the role of the artist. So we're kind of right the way back now to, we saw how randomness was being used at a macro level, a tiny level of making small intuitive decisions, or replacing the notion of making small intuitive decisions, to a point where now it's also part of the global and semantic role that randomness, because it's random, is that idea of questioning who is the artist in the work. So lots going on in a work like that. So let's perhaps bring up to date some of these thoughts and have a look at some contemporary work. Casey Rees, his work. Rees creates contemporary analogies to the work of Nice and Narka by having a global set of rules that dictate the compositional elements of the work. Okay, the work is autonomous, and randomness is used to replace decision-making processes at a micro level. Just to say, there are lots of video links in the PowerPoint, which I would normally show you and we use when we're looking at these works. So you're just going to have to go back and have a look at these in your own time. But as I say, with Casey Rees's work, he's got forms that he creates, and these forms are circles and lines. when you watch the video, you'll see there is some relationship with these numbers. But they're the forms. And then he has a number of behaviors, okay, that dictate where those forms move and leave these trails across the screen. And then there is an output of elements, i.e. the result of these, which again, he has a set of rules that you'll see if you watch the video of how that actually works. But really, he's really much taking on ideas and taking the ideas of Georges and Narc, and playing around with global rules and then micro rules that dictate how it works. Marius Watts, and there's an image there. Do watch this video. Another algorithmic artist. A lot of his ideas have centered around a very simple process of taking a triangle. The process is a subdivision of that triangle, and then there's an iteration of that subdivision. So you end up with these very intense images from that. Boredom Research, it's a great name that. There's a couple who worked using computers and using computers as artists and working a lot with kind of irony, which is something that a lot of artists were using in their work, certainly during the 1990s, early 2000s. The Brit Artists, for example, was a group of artists whose ideas of irony, you only have to look at the work of Tracey Emin and her contemporaries to see what we mean by when we're talking about irony in work. Boredom Research would have certainly have been growing up and working at this time, but and then have moved on to work with computers. And Real Snail Mail was a wonderful wee project whereby they, again, if you watch the video, you'll see that they attached little trackers to each of these snails. And what happened was that you could send a message in that would then be picked up by one of the snails. And then however long it took the snail to work its way across the sort of, not a cage, but the area they were in, it would, you could wait for weeks for it to get to the point where it would drop off your mail the other end and get delivered. And it was live. It was working live. But essentially, you've got the idea of an input, which is the email message. The process is literally the snail carrying the message, and the output is tracking the message and the delivery of the message. And you could see how far your message had got in the process as well. So Boredom Research, Real Snail Mail. This is someone who was playing around with the ideas of using an algorithm that is used to both control what we call STL files. STL files are 3D printing files, okay, and glitching them. So what you could do is you could feed in an STL file. He's created a piece of software that you could interact with, which would glitch that, and then you could get a corruption of your 3D model. So what he's doing is he's creating a 3D glitch, effectively. And again, you've got an input, which is the file, the process, which is the values that you put in here, and the output is the corrupted glitch, okay? Other works. This was a fascinating piece of work that was built as a machine, really, a drawing machine that would have a certain algorithm that trace certain elements within a film. So effectively, you're getting a visual dialogue of the film. Yeah. So it was a computer vision algorithm to watch for areas of prominence, pattern, color, other aspects of each frame in a movie, in addition to some lightweight intelligence algorithms give the computer a measure of agency, letting it pick between, say, a face, a building, or say a sign or something interesting in the background. So there's an idea here that you've got this fascinating idea that it's picking up on certain elements. So the artist is given the computer program a set of rules, and then played the film, and the computer then has a certain amount of agency to which rules it applies and doesn't apply as it goes through watching the film. So you end up with a visual representation of the film, and you can say you can watch these in action if you actually play the link here. Okay, and this is, I suppose, a kind of a great example of a drawing machine, which is what we're working on at the moment. Now then, this project here, I was debating whether to leave this project in, given the climate that we're in at the moment with the coronavirus. Boardman Research produced this fascinating piece of work, which is a really beautiful piece of work. But what they've done is they work with a scientist to simulate the spreading of an infection scenario, which, you know, ironically is something that we're all living through at the moment. But this was a scenario of insects like malaria, modeled on mosquitoes in a virtual world that they created. And they basically made a film out of how this transmission would work and visualized it, working with an artist. As I say, very current, sadly. And as I say, but this was made in 2016. If only they kind of knew where we would be at today. But you may want to go and have a look at the two videos to see how that works in there. But the input is statistical and scientific data that models a mosquito-borne malaria infection transmission scenario. So that's the scenario. And then the process is interpreting that scenario into some kind of into something, and then an interpretation of a full life cycle in real time of a single transmission scenario that puts the audience in the perspective of the mosquito. So you become the mosquito going round this world. Some of you, I know, have certainly come across Holly Herndon's work. She's really starting to experiment with the ideas of using AI and created this, what she calls her AI baby Spawn. And she's effectively teaching Spawn to sing and make music based on learning from her own inputs and others as well. And working with an AI scientist and coder, she effectively, you know, is learning from her parents about how to sing. So do go and watch that and have a little investigation of her work. I hope that has been useful, you going through this. Obviously what we're missing out on is the discussion, which is really vital to these PowerPoint presentations. So all you've got is, unfortunately, me kind of droning on. So anyway, go and have a little look. I thought I would just go through that, give you some idea of some of the thoughts and ideas about how and why we make computer art, what computer art is, and effectively put it in the context with, you know, other forms of art making. Okay, thanks.